The glow of the laptop screen was the only light in Thomas Miller's living room as the December wind rattled the windows and the city outside faded into a blur of holiday lights and cold, empty streets. He sat hunched at the kitchen table, a mug of tea cooling beside him, his hands trembling as he read the email from his only son Ethan for the third time. The words were as sharp and cold as the wind outside. "Dad, I've talked it over with Marie and her family. Your presence at the wedding will embarrass me in front of my French in-laws. Please do not come to Paris. I'll send photos." Thomas stared at the screen, his heart pounding, the cursor blinking at the end of the sentence like a silent accusation. He scrolled up, reading the line again. "I know you paid for everything, but this is about my future." The $180,000 he'd wired for the Paris celebration. Venue, flights, the custom cake, the designer dress, the open bar, suddenly felt like a chain around his neck. He remembered the pride he'd felt when Ethan first called to say he was getting married in Paris, the way he'd told everyone at the hardware store, the way he'd worked overtime and dipped into his retirement to make sure his son's dream wedding would be perfect. Now he was being told to stay away, all because he didn't speak French, all because he might embarrass his son. The humiliation burned, but beneath it, a cold resolve began to grow. Thomas's mind raced with memories, Ethan as a boy running through the backyard, his laughter bright and unguarded. The long nights after his wife died, when it was just the two of them against the world. The sacrifices he'd made, the dreams he'd set aside so Ethan could have every opportunity. He thought of the last time they'd spoken, the way Ethan had brushed off his questions about the wedding, the way Marie's parents had looked at him with polite condescension at the engagement party. He felt the sting of every moment he'd been made to feel small, out of place, not good enough. As the clock ticked past midnight, Thomas drafted a polite reply, wishing Ethan happiness and confirming he would not attend. But as he hit send, a plan began to form, one that would teach his son a lesson he'd never forget. He opened his files, found the contracts for the venue, the caterer, the florist, the band. Every payment, every agreement was in his name. He picked up the phone and began quietly making calls, first to the wedding planner, then to the bank, then to his lawyer. The wheels of silent, strategic payback were set in motion. As the first snow began to fall outside, Thomas sat back in his chair, his anger cooling into something sharper, more focused. He would not beg for a place at his own son's wedding. He would not let Ethan's shame define him. And as he finally turned off the laptop and climbed into bed, he wondered how long it would take for his son to realize what he'd done. The answer came sooner than he expected. When Thomas woke the next morning, his phone was buzzing with notifications, 30 missed calls, a dozen frantic voicemails, and a flood of emails from Ethan, Marie, and even her parents. The Paris wedding was in chaos, the venue locked, the caterer gone, the guests confused. Thomas listened to the first voicemail, Ethan's voice desperate. "Dad, please call me back. We need your help. The wedding is ruined." Thomas set the phone down, his heart heavy but his resolve unbroken. He had been underestimated, dismissed, and humiliated. But now, for the first time in years, he felt in control. The lesson had only just begun. Thomas sat at the kitchen table, the morning sun barely breaking through the gray clouds, his phone vibrating with a relentless stream of notifications. 30 missed calls, a dozen voicemails, and a flood of emails. each one more frantic than the last. He scrolled through the messages, his thumb hovering over Ethan's name, the words of last night's email still echoing in his mind. Your presence will embarrass me in front of my French in-laws. Now the tone was different. Ethan's first voicemail was a panicked whisper, the sound of voices and chaos in the background. Dad, please, something's gone wrong. The venue says the payment was canceled. The caterer isn't answering. Marie's parents are furious. Please call me back. Thomas listened, his heart pounding with a mix of vindication and sorrow. He played the next message. Marie, her voice trembling, switching between English and rapid-fire French. Monsieur Miller, we need your help. The florist says there's no order. The band is gone. What is happening? Thomas could almost picture the scene. The grand Parisian hall locked and empty, the guests milling about in confusion, the French in-laws' faces red with embarrassment and anger. He imagined Ethan, so sure of himself, so eager to impress, now scrambling to explain how the $180,000 wedding had unraveled overnight. Thomas's phone buzzed again. A text from his ex-wife, terse and furious. What did you do? You're ruining Ethan's life. He set the phone down, his hands shaking, and stared out the window at the snow falling softly on the street. He thought of all the years he'd spent putting Ethan first, of the overtime shifts, the missed vacations, the dreams deferred so his son could have every opportunity. He remembered the pride he'd felt wiring the money for the wedding, the hope that maybe, just maybe, this would be the moment when Ethan finally saw him as more than an embarrassment. But now, as the messages piled up, Thomas felt something shift inside him. A sense of freedom, of boundaries finally drawn. He poured himself a cup of coffee, savoring the warmth, and let the phone ring. He would not answer. Not yet. He wanted Ethan to feel the weight of his choices, to understand that respect was not a gift, but something earned. As the morning wore on, the calls grew more desperate. Ethan's voice cracked in the next voicemail. Dad, please, I'm begging you. Marie's family is threatening to sue. The guests are leaving. I don't know what to do. Thomas closed his eyes, the pain of rejection still raw, but now tempered by a quiet satisfaction. He had been underestimated, dismissed, and humiliated. But now, for the first time in years, he was in control. He checked his email. Another message from the wedding planner, apologizing for the chaos, confirming that all contracts had been voided per his instructions. The $180,000 was already being refunded, the money flowing back into his account. Thomas smiled, a small, private smile, and wondered how long it would take for Ethan to realize that the lesson was only just beginning. As the snow continued to fall, Thomas felt a sense of peace settle over him. He had taught his son the value of respect, not with anger but with action. And as he watched the world outside turn white and silent, he knew that the real story was only just beginning. The snow outside thickened, blanketing the world in a hush that made the chaos in Paris feel even more distant, almost unreal. Thomas sat in his living room, the phone silent for the first time all morning, the weight of 30 missed calls and a dozen voicemails pressing on him like a physical thing. He replayed Ethan's last message, the desperation in his son's voice raw and unfamiliar. Dad, please, I'm begging you. I know what I said was wrong. I know I hurt you. But you have to help me. Marie's family is threatening to sue. The guests are leaving. I don't know what to do. Please, Dad. I need you." Thomas set the phone down, his heart pounding with a mix of vindication and sorrow. He thought of all the years he'd spent putting Ethan first, of the sacrifices he'd made, the dreams he'd set aside so his son could have every opportunity. He remembered the pride he'd felt wiring the money for the wedding, the hope that maybe, just maybe, this would be the moment when Ethan finally saw him as more than an embarrassment. But now, as the messages piled up, Thomas felt something shift inside him. A sense of freedom, of boundaries finally drawn. He poured himself another cup of coffee, the warmth steadying his hands, and stared out the window at the world turning white. He wondered if Ethan had ever truly seen him, or if he'd always been just a wallet, a means to an end. The thought stung, but it also brought clarity. He checked his email again, and there it was. A new message from Ethan, the subject line simply, "I'm sorry." Thomas hesitated, his finger hovering over the mouse. He opened the email, his eyes scanning the words. "Dad, I know I don't deserve your forgiveness. I know I was cruel. I was trying to impress Marie's family, to prove I belonged. I thought if I could just make everything perfect, they'd accept me. But I was wrong. I hurt you, and now I've lost everything. Please, Dad. I need your help. I need you." The words were raw, stripped of pride, and for the first time Thomas heard the voice of the boy he'd raised. The boy who used to run to him with scraped knees and wild stories. The boy who had once believed his father could fix anything. Thomas felt tears prick his eyes, the pain of rejection mingling with a fierce, protective love. He wanted to forgive Ethan, to reach out and pull him back from the edge, but he also knew that forgiveness without consequences was just another form of enabling. He closed the laptop, his decision made. He would not answer, not yet. He would let Ethan sit with the consequences, let him feel the weight of his choices. Only then, when the lesson had truly sunk in, would Thomas consider opening the door to reconciliation. As the afternoon faded into evening, Thomas sat by the fire, the world outside silent and still. He thought of the Paris wedding, the guests milling about in confusion, the French in-laws' faces red with embarrassment and anger. He imagined Ethan, so sure of himself, now scrambling to explain how the $180,000 wedding had unraveled overnight. Thomas smiled, a small, private smile, and wondered how long it would take for his son to realize that respect was not a gift, but something earned. The lesson was only just beginning, and for the first time in years, Thomas felt in control. The real story was only just beginning. The day after Ethan's final desperate email, Thomas tried to lose himself in routine, shoveling the walk, making a slow breakfast, reading the paper twice. But nothing could quiet the storm of emotions inside him. The phone was mercifully silent, the barrage of calls and messages finally subsiding, but the silence felt heavier than the noise. He wondered what was happening in Paris, whether the guests had found other places to celebrate, whether Marie's family blamed Ethan or him, whether his son was wandering the city in shame or anger or both. The thought brought no satisfaction, only a dull ache. As Thomas sat by the window watching the snow swirl in the streetlights, a knock at the door startled him. He opened it to find his sister, Margaret, bundled in a red scarf, her cheeks flushed from the cold. She stepped inside, stamping snow from her boots, her eyes searching his face. "I heard about the wedding," she said quietly. "Ethan called me. He's a mess, Tom. He's blaming you, but I think he's really blaming himself." Thomas poured her a cup of coffee, the familiar ritual grounding him. Margaret sat across from him, her hands wrapped around the mug. "He told me what he said to you. About being embarrassed. About not wanting you there." She shook her head, her voice trembling with anger and sadness. "I wanted to slap him. But I also wanted to hug him. He's lost, Tom. He's always been lost." Thomas stared into his coffee, the steam blurring his vision. "I just wanted to give him everything I never had. I wanted him to be proud of me." Margaret reached across the table, her hand warm on his. "He will be. But not because you paid for a wedding. Because you finally stood up for yourself." The words hit Thomas harder than he expected. He realized that, for the first time, he wasn't the one apologizing, the one making excuses, the one bending over backward to keep the peace. He had drawn a line, and it had cost him dearly, but it had also set him free. Margaret squeezed his hand. "You have a right to be loved, Tom. Not just needed." As she left, Thomas felt a strange sense of peace settle over him. The world outside was still cold and uncertain, but inside, something had shifted. He sat by the fire that night, the house quiet around him, and wrote a letter to Ethan. He didn't send it, he wasn't ready for that, but he poured out everything he'd been holding back. The pain, the pride, the hope that one day his son would understand that love was not about money or appearances, but about respect. As he finished the letter, Thomas realized that the real lesson wasn't just for Ethan, it was for himself. He had spent a lifetime trying to earn his place in his own family, but now, for the first time, he was learning to claim it. The next morning, as the sun rose over the snow-covered city, Thomas felt ready for whatever came next. The story was far from over, and the next chapter would be written on his terms. The days after Margaret's visit passed in a strange, suspended quiet, as if the world itself was waiting to see what Thomas would do next. He kept to his routines, shoveling the walk, reading the news, and making simple meals, but his mind was never far from Paris, from Ethan, from the echo of that cold email and the chaos that had followed. The phone remained mostly silent, save for a few awkward calls from distant relatives and one terse voicemail from his ex-wife. "You've made your point, Tom. I hope you're happy." He deleted it without listening to the end. Then, on a snowy Thursday morning, an envelope arrived in the mail, thick and official, with a return address from a law firm in Paris. Thomas opened it with trembling hands, expecting more threats or demands for payment. Instead, he found a letter from the owner of the Parisian wedding venue. "Monsieur Miller, we regret the circumstances of your son's wedding. We have never seen such a generous, thoughtful client. If you ever wish to visit Paris, we would be honored to host you, at no charge. Your kindness and dignity have not gone unnoticed." Attached was a voucher for a week's stay in the city, along with a handwritten note from the chef. "For the father who paid for a feast he never tasted. You are welcome at my table any time." Thomas sat at the kitchen table, the letter in his hands, and felt a wave of emotion crash over him. gratitude, vindication, and a bittersweet sense of justice. He realized that even in the midst of humiliation and betrayal, his actions had been seen, respected, and remembered. That afternoon, Carter called from the bank, his voice full of good news. "The last of the refunds have cleared, Tom. The money's all back in your account. You're whole again." Thomas thanked him, his voice thick with relief. He spent the evening writing thank you notes to the venue, the chef, and the planner, his words sincere and full of grace. As he sealed the envelopes, he felt a sense of closure settling over him. He had lost a wedding, but he had gained something far more valuable: his self-respect and the knowledge that he could stand on his own. That night, as he sat by the fire, Thomas allowed himself to dream of Paris, not as a place of pain, but as a city of new beginnings. He wondered if he would ever take the venue up on their offer, if he would ever walk the streets of Paris as a guest, not an outsider. The thought made him smile, a small, private smile, and for the first time in weeks he slept soundly. The next morning, as the sun rose over the snow-covered city, Thomas felt ready for whatever came next. The story was far from over, and the next chapter would be written on his terms. The Paris invitation sat on Thomas's kitchen table for days, a symbol of both what he had lost and what he might still gain. He would pick it up, run his thumb over the embossed lettering, and imagine himself walking the cobblestone streets, tasting the food he'd paid for but never shared, sitting at a table where he was finally welcome. But each time the memory of Ethan's words, "Your presence will embarrass me," would echo in his mind, and he would set the invitation aside, unsure if he was ready to forgive or even to move on. The phone remained mostly silent, the storm of calls and messages from Paris now reduced to a trickle of awkward apologies and half-hearted explanations from distant relatives. Then one evening, as Thomas was finishing dinner, his phone buzzed with a new message. It was from Ethan, the subject line simply, "I'm sorry." Thomas hesitated, his heart pounding before opening the email. The words were raw, stripped of pride, and for the first time Thomas heard the voice of the boy he'd raised. The boy who used to run to him with scraped knees and wild stories. The boy who had once believed his father could fix anything. "Dad, I know I don't deserve your forgiveness. I know I was cruel. I was trying to impress Marie's family, to prove I belonged. I thought if I could just make everything perfect, they'd accept me. But I was wrong. I hurt you and now I've lost everything. Marie's family blames me for the wedding disaster. They're talking about annulment. I'm alone, Dad. I need you." The words hit Thomas like a punch, the pain of rejection mingling with a fierce, protective love. He wanted to forgive Ethan, to reach out and pull him back from the edge, but he also knew that forgiveness without consequences was just another form of enabling. He closed the laptop, his decision made. He would not answer, not yet. He would let Ethan sit with the consequences, let him feel the weight of his choices. Only then, when the lesson had truly sunk in, would Thomas consider opening the door to reconciliation. That night, Thomas sat by the fire, the world outside silent and still. He thought of the Paris wedding, the guests milling about in confusion, the French in-laws' faces red with embarrassment and anger. He imagined Ethan, so sure of himself, now scrambling to explain how the $180,000 wedding had unraveled overnight. Thomas smiled, a small, private smile, and wondered how long it would take for his son to realize that respect was not a gift, but something earned. The lesson was only just beginning, and for the first time in years, Thomas felt in control. The real story was only just beginning. The days that followed Ethan's desperate email were a study in silence and suspense. Thomas went about his routines, grocery shopping, reading the paper, tending to the small garden behind his house. But every quiet moment was haunted by the memory of his son's voice, raw and pleading, echoing in his mind. He wondered what was happening in Paris, whether Ethan was still trying to salvage the wreckage of his wedding or if Marie's family had already turned their backs on him. The phone remained silent, the Paris invitation still sitting on the kitchen table, a symbol of both what could have been and what had been lost. Then late one night, Thomas's phone buzzed with a new message. This time it was from Marie herself. Her English was formal but clear, her pain unmistakable. "Monsieur Miller, I'm sorry for what happened. My family is very angry. They blame Ethan, but I know it was not all his fault. He tried to make everyone happy, but he lost himself. I hope you can forgive him. I hope you can forgive me." Thomas read the message twice, his heart aching for the young couple, for the dream that had turned to dust. He thought of his own marriage, of the mistakes he and his late wife had made, of the forgiveness that had saved them more than once. He realized that Ethan was not the only one who had been humbled by the disaster in Paris. The next morning, Thomas received a call from Carter, the Parisian wedding planner. "Monsieur Miller, I wanted to thank you for your kindness. Many clients would have blamed us, but you were gracious. If you ever wish to visit Paris, our doors are open to you." The words warmed Thomas, a reminder that dignity and respect could ripple outward, touching lives he would never know. That afternoon, as he sat in the garden, Ethan called. This time Thomas answered. The conversation was halting at first, both men struggling to find their footing. Ethan apologized again, his voice thick with regret. "Dad, I was wrong. I let pride and fear get in the way. I hurt you and I hurt myself. I don't expect you to forgive me, but I want to try to make things right." Thomas listened, his anger softened by the sincerity in his son's voice. "Ethan, respect isn't something you can demand. It's something you earn. I love you, but I won't let you treat me like I don't matter." There was a long silence, then Ethan's voice, small and hopeful. "Can we start over?" Thomas smiled, tears in his eyes. "We can try." As the sun set over the garden, Thomas realized that the true lesson was not about money or pride, but about the courage to forgive, and the strength to demand respect. The Paris wedding was over, but the story of father and son was just beginning a new chapter. The days after that first honest conversation with Ethan felt like the slow thaw after a long, bitter winter. Thomas found himself checking his phone less for missed calls and more for the simple pleasure of a new message from his son. Their talks were tentative at first, full of awkward pauses and the careful navigation of old wounds, but each call ended with a little more hope, a little less pain. Then one afternoon, as Thomas was pruning the roses in his backyard, his phone buzzed with a message that made his heart skip. "Dad, Marie and I want to try again. We're having a small ceremony in Paris. Just us, her parents, and, if you're willing, you." Thomas stared at the screen, the words blurring as tears filled his eyes. He thought of the Paris invitation still sitting on his kitchen table, the one he'd never used, and the letter from the venue owner who had promised him a place at their table. He called Carter, the planner, who answered with a warmth that felt like an embrace. "Monsieur Miller, we would be honored to host you. The chef still remembers your kindness." Thomas booked his flight, the act itself a leap of faith, a declaration that the past would not have the final word. The journey to Paris was surreal. His first time traveling alone in years, his first time stepping into a world that had once felt close to him. The city was everything he'd imagined: grand, chaotic, beautiful, and alive. When he arrived at the venue, Marie greeted him with a hug, her eyes shining with gratitude and relief. "Thank you for coming, Thomas. It means everything to Ethan." The ceremony was simple, held in a sunlit garden with the Eiffel Tower in the distance, the air filled with the scent of lavender and the sound of laughter. Ethan stood before him, nervous but sincere, and when he spoke his vows, he looked at Thomas with a humility that was new and hard-won. Afterward, at the reception, Ethan raised a glass. "To my father, who taught me that respect is earned, not given. I'm sorry it took me so long to learn." The guests applauded, and Thomas felt the last of his anger melt away. He realized that forgiveness was not a single act, but a journey, a series of choices to let go, to trust, to love again. As the sun set over Paris, Thomas sat at the chef's table, surrounded by new friends and old wounds finally healing, and knew that the story of the ruined wedding had become something else entirely. A story of redemption, of second chances, and of the quiet, unbreakable bond between a father and his son. The days that followed the small Paris ceremony were a dreamlike blur for Thomas, each moment colored by the city's beauty and the fragile hope of a family rediscovered. He walked the cobblestone streets with Ethan and Marie, marveling at the way the city seemed to glow at dusk, the Seine reflecting the golden lights of the bridges, the air alive with the sound of music and laughter. For the first time in years, Thomas felt not like an outsider, but like a man who belonged, welcomed not for his money but for his presence, his stories, his willingness to forgive. Marie's parents, once distant and formal, now greeted him with genuine warmth, their English halting but their kindness unmistakable. One afternoon, as they all sat in a quiet café near Montmartre, Marie's father leaned across the table, his eyes serious. "Monsieur Miller, there is something you should know. When the wedding was cancelled, we were angry, at Ethan, at you, at everyone. But then we learned the truth. We saw how much you had given, how much you had sacrificed. We realized that respect is not about language or money, but about the heart." He slid a small envelope across the table. "This is for you. A letter from my father, written before he died. He wanted you to have it." Thomas opened the envelope, his hands trembling. Inside was a note, written in careful French, with an English translation beneath. "To the man who gives without asking, who loves without pride. Family is not measured by blood, but by the courage to forgive. Welcome to our family." Thomas felt tears sting his eyes, the weight of years of rejection and humiliation lifting in an instant. Ethan reached for his hand, his grip strong and sure. "Dad, I'm sorry for everything. I was so afraid of not fitting in, of not being enough. I thought if I could just make everything perfect, I'd finally belong. But I see now that I was wrong. You're the reason I belong anywhere." The words broke something open in Thomas, a flood of grief and gratitude and love. He hugged his son, the city spinning around them, and knew that the final secret was not about money or pride, but about the simple, stubborn power of forgiveness. That night, as they walked along the river, Marie slipped her arm through Thomas's and whispered, "Thank you for giving us a second chance." Thomas smiled, the lights of Paris reflected in his eyes, and realized that the greatest inheritance he could give, or receive, was the courage to love, even after everything had gone wrong. The past was still there, a scar that would never fully fade, but it no longer defined him. The future for the first time felt wide open. The final days in Paris unfolded with a gentle magic that Thomas had never expected to find again. The city, once a symbol of exclusion and heartbreak, now felt like a place of healing and new beginnings. Ethan and Marie insisted on showing him every corner. Sunlit mornings at the flower market, afternoons spent wandering the halls of the Louvre, evenings filled with laughter and stories at tiny bistros where the waiters greeted Thomas like an old friend. The awkwardness that had once hung between father and son was gone, replaced by a quiet understanding and a shared determination to make up for lost time. On their last night, Marie's parents hosted a small dinner in their apartment overlooking the city. The table was set with care, candles flickering, the scent of roast chicken and fresh bread filling the air. As the meal ended, Ethan stood and cleared his throat, his face flushed with emotion. "Dad, there's something we want to give you before you go." He handed Thomas a small wrapped box. Inside was a set of keys and a folded deed. "It's not much," Ethan said, his voice trembling, "but it's yours. Marie and I bought a little cottage outside the city. We want you to have it, a place to come whenever you want, a place where you'll always be welcome." Thomas stared at the keys, his hands shaking, the weight of the gesture settling over him like a blessing. Marie smiled, her eyes shining. "You gave us everything, Thomas. This is just a small way to say thank you, and to show you that you'll never be left out again." The room was silent for a moment, then filled with applause and laughter as Thomas hugged his son and daughter-in-law, tears streaming down his face. He realized that the true gift was not the cottage or the keys, but the knowledge that he had finally been seen, respected, and loved for who he was. That night, as he sat on the balcony overlooking the city, Thomas reflected on the journey that had brought him here. The pain of rejection, the courage to set boundaries, the slow, hard work of forgiveness. He understood now that family was not about perfection or pride, but about the willingness to try again, to open your heart even after it's been broken. The Paris lights shimmered below, and Thomas felt a peace deeper than any he had ever known. The story that had begun with humiliation and loss had become one of redemption and hope, a story he would carry with him wherever he went. The flight home from Paris was quiet, the hum of the engines a gentle backdrop to Thomas's thoughts as he gazed out the window at the endless blue sky. The keys to the cottage rested in his pocket, a tangible reminder that the world could still surprise him, that love and forgiveness could bloom even in the stoniest soil. When he landed, the city felt different, less cold, less lonely, as if the act of reclaiming his dignity had changed not just his family, but the very air he breathed. The first thing Thomas did was visit the shelter where he'd once volunteered, bringing pastries from a local bakery and a donation that would keep the lights on for months. The staff greeted him with hugs and laughter, their gratitude genuine, their stories a reminder that everyone was fighting a battle, seen or unseen. Thomas found himself drawn into their community, his days filled with purpose and connection. He started a support group for parents who had been estranged from their children, sharing his story with a humility that inspired others to hope for reconciliation. The group grew quickly, each meeting a tapestry of pain and healing, of anger and forgiveness. Thomas listened, offered advice when asked, and learned as much from the others as they did from him. He kept in touch with Ethan and Marie, their calls and messages now a source of joy rather than anxiety. They sent photos of the cottage as they fixed it up, Ethan painting the shutters, Marie planting roses in the garden, their faces alight with the happiness that comes from building something together. Thomas realized that the greatest revenge was not in payback, but in living well, in refusing to let bitterness define him. He forgave Ethan, not because he had to, but because he wanted to, because he understood now that forgiveness was a gift he gave himself. The Paris wedding was a memory, a lesson, a turning point. The future was wide open, and Thomas was ready to embrace it. On the anniversary of the canceled wedding, he hosted a dinner for his support group, filling his home with laughter, music, and the warmth of chosen family. As the night wore on and the guests drifted home, Thomas sat on his porch, the city lights twinkling in the distance, and felt a peace deeper than any he had ever known. He had survived the storm, reclaimed his dignity, and found a new beginning. The story that had started with heartbreak had become one of hope, a story he would carry with him wherever he went. The first morning in the Paris cottage was quiet, the kind of quiet that feels earned after a lifetime of storms. Thomas awoke to sunlight streaming through lace curtains, the scent of roses drifting in from the garden Marie had planted, and the distant sound of church bells echoing across the fields. He made coffee in the tiny kitchen, savoring the warmth in his hands, and stepped outside to watch the city wake up. The cottage was small but perfect, every corner filled with reminders of forgiveness and new beginnings. Photos of Ethan and Marie, a stack of letters from his support group back home, a shelf of books he'd always meant to read. As he sat on the porch, a letter arrived, slipped under the door by the caretaker. It was from Ethan, written in a careful hand that spoke of thought and effort. "Dad, I wanted to thank you for everything, for the money, yes, but more for the chance to start over. I know I hurt you, and I know I can never take back what I said. But you taught me that love is not about pride or perfection, but about the courage to forgive and to try again. Marie and I are expecting a baby. We hope you'll be part of our family's story from the very beginning. I love you, Dad." Thomas read the letter twice, his eyes blurring with tears. He thought of the journey that had brought him here, the humiliation of being cast out, the cold nights in his car, the shock of sudden wealth, the pain and hope of reconciliation. He realized that the truest legacy was not the $180,000 he'd lost or the millions he'd gained, but the strength to set boundaries, the wisdom to forgive, and the grace to begin again. That afternoon, Ethan and Marie arrived, their faces alight with joy and nervous anticipation. They walked the garden together, talking of the future, of the child to come, of the lessons they hoped to pass on. As the sun set over the Paris rooftops, Thomas raised a glass to his son, his daughter-in-law, and the life they were building together. To family, he said, his voice steady and full of hope. To second chances, and to the courage to love even when it's hard. The cottage filled with laughter and the promise of new memories, the scars of the past faded but never forgotten. Thomas knew that the story of the Paris wedding would be told for years to come, not as a tale of revenge, but as a testament to the power of dignity, forgiveness, and the quiet, unbreakable bond between a father and his son. As the stars appeared overhead and the world grew still, Thomas closed his eyes, grateful for the journey, and ready for whatever tomorrow might bring.